Is that the same shirt from WWDC 2012?
That's a great question.
Are there any parallels between designing software and designing Broadway plays?
It's exactly the same. There's a lot of black turtlenecks.
Scott Forstall was called Apple's chief asshole, and the only mini Steve Jobs Cupertino ever had. He had a jeweler loop in his office to check individual pixels of applications, drove the same car as Steve Jobs, had his own styled uniform, and is known for shipping legendary macOS Leopard and the first version of iPhone OS. In this video, I'll tell you about his crazy arrogant management style that led him to being fired from Apple. After Stanford University, Scott briefly considered working at Microsoft, but he went to interview at Next First, a company Steve Jobs created after being fired from Apple. So then he sits at the interview.
I went in the morning, very first interview of the day. I'd been there 10 minutes. Steve barges into the interview room, grabs the guy that's interviewing, takes him out, and they have this very animated conversation in the hallway. And I sit there waiting, and then the door opens, and Steve comes back in. That guy is not there. That was not on my list of people interviewing me. And he starts peppering me with all these questions. And I'm answering them, and we actually kind of, we clicked. And 15 minutes later, he looks at me and says, "I don't care what anyone says the rest of the day. We're giving you an offer." Pretend you care in the interviews, though. And then he said, "We're giving you an offer, and I know you're going to accept it."
And in many ways, he was like a mini Steve, extremely detail-oriented, drove the same silver Mercedes SL55 AMG, and had as his signature costume, black shoes, jeans, and a black zippered sweater. Oh, and he really knew how to translate the technical stuff into plain English for his engineers. But perhaps most importantly, like Jobs, Forstall was a polarizing dude. His engineers were amongst the hardest working at the company, super loyal to him, but lots and lots of senior Apple leadership couldn't stand Forstall, and that included lead designer Johnny Ive, Tony Fadell, who created an iPod, Johnny Rubinstein, who was Johnny Ive's boss in early 90s, Mac hardware chief Bob Mansfield, and many, many outside iOS team engineers. And Johnny Ive and Bob Mansfield actually wouldn't even attend a meeting if Forstall was there and Tim Cook wasn't attending to facilitate.
It's absolutely amazing.
But why, right? Scott took credit for collaborative successes so often. He deflected the blame for his mistakes, and he loved politics. He really adored it. He was like a young Steve Jobs. He was an arrogant prick that didn't want to collaborate with you or share information on projects he worked on, and he loved to block ideas if he deemed them to be not worthy of the Steve Jobs level. And while Steve Jobs was alive, that confrontation was okay. But when he died, things started to go sideways for Scott very quickly. When Apple acquired Next in 1996 and Jobs returned to become interim CEO, Scott Forstall was put in charge to design a user interface for Mac. And in 2000, he was a lead designer for Mac's new user interface, Aqua. Like Steve presented it, when you saw it, you wanted to lick it. And then Forstall was in charge of the engineers that created one of the most well-regarded Mac OSs ever, Leopard, and then of course followed up by Snow Leopard. So there's really no doubt that he was incredibly good at shipping high-quality, complex software releases under ungodly amounts of pressure. But that just wasn't enough.
We'd been working on a tablet project, which has a really odd beginning. It began because Steve hated this guy at Microsoft. That is the actual origin of it. And it wasn't Bill, because he was starting to like Bill by this point. It was Laureen had a friend, so Steve's wife had a friend who was married to a guy who worked at Microsoft. Every time Steve had any social interaction with that guy, he'd come back just pissed off. And I mean, it was not in like Microsoft's, like, you know, it was not good for them that he ever saw him. And he came back one time after seeing this guy, and that guy was talking about how Microsoft had solved computing. They solved like laptop computing, or they were going to do laptop or tablet computing, and they're going to do it with pens. And he just like shoved it in Steve's face the way they were going to like rule the world with their new tablets, with their pens. And Steve came in on Monday, and there was a set of expletives, and then it was like, let's show them how it's really done. At the time, touchscreens were resistive touch.
Yep.
Resistive requires you to sort of deform the screen. You have to push it down. So if you look at it like text and everything looks bad, it's really tiring on your finger. He said, we need to do capacitive touch, and it has to be multi-touch. So we went to the hardware team and basically said, like, go do this. And they started, and the design team started building designs around this idea of multi-touch. And it was pretty interesting. I remember one of the first demos of this. You walked into a room. There's a giant, giant table. There's a projector on the ceiling. And you can, like, you see a photo or something on the table, and you could move your finger around the table, and it would move the photo. It was super cool. But the moment you saw that, you knew this was the way to go.
But over time, and especially since 2005, when Forstall was building the first version of iOS for an iPhone, he was getting more and more enemies at Cupertino, which then was followed up by quite a very well-known incident in 2010 when he convinced Steve Jobs to allow his engineers to carry iPhone 4 prototypes to better test its network performance and minimize dropped calls. And then, sure enough, one of them left his precious iPhone 4 on a bar stool at German beer hall. And that got to Gizmodo journalists, and then the whole police investigation, Steve Jobs calling those guys, threatening those guys, etc., etc., etc. It's like a Hollywood story. And then, remember your holding it run and Tenagate? When iPhone 4 dropped calls, Steve Jobs did the whole press conference, got pulled from the vacation in 2010, and then a reporter during the event asked a question about, hey, like, is software contributing to these dropped calls? Scott Forstall took the mic and said there was no software glitch and such claims were patently false. But later on, former Apple employees did confirm that software contributed to the problem. It was just Scott Forstall in his blame defecting mode. So how come such brilliant, albeit jerky software boss Scott Forstall survived at Apple for that long? 2 words: Steve Jobs. Steve saw a younger himself in Forstall, and he loved to work with massively ambitious freaks. Scott checked almost all the boxes. He was an ultimate student for an ultimate teacher. And Jobs protected Forstall from an insatiable desire of other Apple execs to get rid of him.
Steve was a unique person on this planet. He was the most intense person I've ever known. I've met a number of world leaders, and I can tell you from experience, having dinner with a world leader is relaxing compared to like lunch on a Tuesday with Steve. He was super driven, very demanding. He forced people to do their best.
But after Steve's death, Forstall started to lose momentum within Cupertino's halls, and one of the main reasons for that was power struggle with Johnny Ive, Apple's most valued human asset after Steve Jobs. And Johnny and Forstall, they crashed over lots of different things, and skeuomorphic design, of course, was one big one. Forstall loved it, Johnny hated it, and it's basically a design language that mimicked real-world objects, but could look rather odd, like a leather calendar in macOS Lion.
I had never heard the term skeuomorphism until years after we built the iPhone. If you look at the designs we did at Apple, we talked about photo-illustrative designs. We talked about metaphorical designs. And those were infused into the design sense of Apple by Steve Jobs since the original Mac, if not earlier. Yep. The original Mac had a desktop and folders that looked very much like the desktop on which that Mac sat. Yeah. And so we used these design philosophies. It doesn't mean that we loved every single part of it. It doesn't mean I loved every single part of it. There's definitely things that I was less a fan of than others. But we built these designs that worked. And how do we know they worked? I mean, you just had to watch people use it.
And another factor that didn't help Forstall was Apple's new CEO, Tim Cook, who did not like constant confrontations and wanted to have more harmonious atmosphere, versus Jobs loved fighting and arguing and all of that.
Beautiful maps. We have built an entire new mapping solution from the ground up, and it is beautiful.
And then in 2011, it all exploded with the release of Apple Maps as a part of iOS 6. Apple's most memorable software failure of all time, made by Forstall's team. The way that he reacted really sealed his fate at Apple. Of course, the maps were unusable, buggy as hell, massively underdeveloped, missing parts of cities. It routed people to no man's lands. It made a dent in Apple's reputation, and Scott refused to sign an apology letter. Steve Jobs wouldn't do that either, and it probably would have worked, as a matter of fact, for Scott if Steve Jobs was around to protect him, but he wasn't. And with no Jobs around, Tim Cook fired Forstall, to a huge cheer from lots and lots of Apple employees, and signed the letter of apology himself. As a matter of fact, there were reports that a lot of people went for celebratory drinks after that happened. Forstall really wasn't that much online after being fired from Apple, and then he started doing Broadway shows, producing them, and I think he's still doing it. And then he did one-off thing on his LinkedIn, which was being a consultant for Snapchat. And that was it. Thank you guys for watching. This is Scott Forstall, the chief Apple asshole and the only mini Steve Jobs Apple ever had. I hope you enjoyed this little video. Please leave it down in a comment. What do you think about Scott Forstall? How terrible it was for Apple to fire him, or was it really a good idea? I'd appreciate that. Thank you for watching. Consider adding a sub for the future videos, and I'll see you soon again.
There was one time, a meeting we had at Apple, we were trying to price something, and Steve was arguing for some price, and I was arguing for another one, and he was arguing for this higher price, and I said, it's too high, and he's like, no, this is what people are gonna pay this. I said, I have friends, I have relatives who have very little money, like, this is too high. I said, you're a billionaire, you don't understand. And he paused and looked at me and said, I'm a multi-billionaire.